OP09 has massively changed the meta, and although you may end up seeing the same couple of decks over and over again at the top, there are a lot of decks that have done quite well, especially in Japanese championships, that just barely couldn't quite make the last step. On this channel, I tend to talk about the most present decks as the meta evolves in Japan. However, in this video, we're going to be talking about some of the unsung heroes and sleeper decks in the OP09 metagame. In this video, I've aggregated many championship results that have done very well despite using these sort of minor decks. And I believe that with more tweaking or the right meta, some of these decks can actually become viable. If you guys are interested in these kinds of recaps or even getting ahead on information in the OP10 meta, I think this is the best channel to do that. So if you would consider subscribing, I would greatly appreciate it. Let's move on to the video. The first list that we're going to be talking about is Black Smoker. Now, there were actually a couple of Black Smoker results. Generally, because Black Smoker doesn't have access to the CP package, he is restricted to playing in the Navy package, which makes him quite different from the way that Lucci wants to play. Lucci tends to play in a way that plays through the 4-cost Lucci to try to clear 2 things per turn. However, as Smoker doesn't have that, he needs to have another strength, and that strength comes through the 5-cost Tashigi. Now, this 5-cost Tashigi is actually quite strong because it doesn't KO the target, it trashes it. And a 5-cost 6000 that on its own trashes a 4-cost, but with leader ability trashes a 5-cost, is the reason why Smoker has a solid chance in this meta. The reason for this is because it has a significantly better teach matchup than Lucci does. Because this Tashigi trashes the card, it can actually get rid of the teach player's Jesus Bajitsu. And although you can't use the on-play effect that minuses 4 costs, you can use it in tandem with any sort of cost reduction to be able to get rid of these cards. The biggest threat in the teach deck is this Jesus Bajitsu, even before the 10-cost teach, as the 10-cost teach can be dealt with something like the 9-cost Kaido. Smoker can deal with this Bajitsu much easier than someone like Lucci can, which is why I think that Smoker actually has a decent chance in this meta. The one difference though is that it has a slightly worse Doflamingo matchup. If you can find a way to remedy this Doflamingo matchup and keep this teach matchup still winning, I think that Smoker can actually be a meta threat, and this is one of the minor decks that I think has the most potential to actually break into the meta. The next deck to talk about is Reiju. Now, I think that Reiju has 2 different ways that you can build her. I personally prefer to play through the 8-cost Judge. However, the more prominent and popular version of Reiju plays through the 3-cost Poruche. Now, this 3-cost Poruche, although it cannot search the Germa cards within your deck, can actually play the small versions of the Germa cards. As such, if you can play Poruche and then also connect it into these other cards, you can explode your board in the early game if you manage to draw them. Also, Poruche can search herself. However, the point of this deck is not to hit the search and is more to play the cards. The search hitting should always just be a bonus. This version of the deck did quite well in a couple of championships, and I think that's largely due to the explosive power it can have in the early game if it manages to draw these things such as Poruche as well as Ichiji. Although there is a sort of high roll aspect to this, if you do manage to draw this, you can actually beat many decks. Even Doflamingo struggles a lot if you can manage to keep playing the 7-cost Ichiji and the 5-cost Niji, due to the fact that Niji can actually bounce a 4-cost, which is quite rare for a 5-cost character. And Neji, of course, is a 3-cost character if you play the small Niji first and also draws you a card. In this way, Reiju has a lot of resources compared to some decks, has an explosive start, and can finish out the game thanks to cards such as Ichiji and being able to recur them off of the Sora. Reiju uses her resources to defend her board to maintain this pressure and push through the opponent. Now, speaking of Poruche as well as the Foxy Pirate package, let's talk about the leader that can use this the best, and that is, of course, Foxy. For a very brief time in Japan, we saw a huge explosion of Foxy, and this was actually due to the fact that Foxy basically almost never loses to Doflamingo and also has a very good teach matchup thanks to his leader ability. The Shanks matchup could also be managed due to the fact that his leader ability locks the 10-cost Shanks, delaying the game to the point where he could eventually push back. The key card in this deck is 7-cost Foxy. 7-cost Foxy is similar to 10-cost Shanks, where it reduces the opponent's power by 1,000. However, it's 7-cost. And being 7-cost means that it can come up to 3 turns earlier than Shanks if he's going first. And in this way, if you're using things like Poruche as well as the 7-cost Foxy, you can spread out your board just as hard as a Flamingo, but delay the game much easier due to the fact that you have your leader ability as well as many different ways to increase your Dong, finally finishing out the game with Megadon QB Rush. In this way, Foxy is a very dynamic deck. One thing to note is that this deck absolutely sucks against things like Lucci, so do be careful if you bring it into a black meta, as you can't use your leader effect unless you have 3 or more Foxy Pirates already on the board. A few weeks ago, I actually fought a Filipino player who used almost the same list in OP10 and was still destroying people. He won 2 locals back-to-back while he was here with me, and it just goes to show that these sorts of decks aren't just about meta, but also about how much the opponent understands the deck. If the opponent doesn't know how to play against the deck, then the decks become much stronger. And as such, I think that these sorts of decks are valuable to the meta and do have merit in taking to things like nationals or regionals because people just aren't as experienced against them and have not practiced against them. The next deck that I want to talk about is Kalgara. I've noticed actually that a lot of people enjoy Kalgara, especially in the West, so I'm really excited to show you this list. This list at first seems quite standard, however it does run a couple of interesting cards. The 5-cost Kataguri is very good in this deck as it puts a Dong onto your leader. This means that on the 5 Dong turn, you can play 5-cost Kataguri, which is of course also a blocker, and still use the effect to be able to use your leader effect on the same turn. I think that Kalgara tends to struggle with being able to survive due to the fact that his leader ability keeps drawing his life. However, he uses things like the 5-cost Kataguri as well as the 2-cost Zangiri Mochi to be able to fight better into the Doflamingo matchup. If we see his championship run on the day, he actually hit multiple Doflamingos on the day, only losing to the last one. As such, I think if you want to play Kalgara and need to tech for the Doflamingo matchup, then maybe consider these cards. In these videos, I tend to only show the lists that do quite well in the tournaments and ignore the ones that don't do too well. However, this is the only Kalgara list that I ever saw during the entire championship period, and it also did quite well. So maybe Kalgara is a sleeper pick. However, as I didn't play it, I can't really comment on this. The next deck that I'm going to talk about might surprise a couple of people, and that is Blue-Black Rebecca. Now this Rebecca list is quite different from the ones that I tend to play. It plays through the boss monsters in blue as well as black in Aramaki and Tenkas Kuzan. By playing Aramaki on 8 and then Tenkas Kuzan on 10, you can immediately KO a 5-cost as well as bottom deck a 7-cost from that turn onward as long as they stick on the board. Not only this, but as Aramaki is a blocker, this deck is really trying to stall out the game until it can eventually pull off this pure blue and black combo. Many people have been asking me about an OP09 Rebecca list, and although I think that the buffs in OP10 are too significant for me to want to actually play OP9 Rebecca due to the fact that we now have the 4-cost Zoro, I think that this is a fairly interesting list because it did, of course, end up doing quite well. One card that I do want to point out is Hydodin. Now, Hydodin is actually a card that I used to play a lot in Rebecca in OP04, and it's also very good right now in this kind of list due to the fact that Orombus doesn't really stick to the board too well. You can see Shanks recently not running Lucky Roo, and this is due to the fact that things like Black Hole or the 4-cost slot from Doflamingo tend to get rid of them. And as Orombus is also a 4-cost, he suffers from the same weaknesses. Hydodin does not need to have any characters on the board, and of course as your leader doesn't attack, it doesn't matter if she gets rested, and still minus his 4-cost. In this way, if you can set him up with something like 3-cost Brook or use him with Aramaki, you can KO or bottom many big characters for very cheap while still having a very large board. I remember back in OP06 when they showed Aramaki, I tried to do this in Sakazuki, so it is quite interesting to see finally Rebecca doing it now that Sakazuki is of course banned. For those who really want to cope Rebecca, perhaps consider this as a starting point. Now one deck that people are really curious about is Purple-Black Luffy. Now, Purple-Black Luffy you don't see too much in the meta, but there is actually a pretty decent number of Purple-Black Luffy wins. The results I'm going to be showing are from unofficial tournaments because for some reason I couldn't find any from championships. However, in unofficial tournaments, there are actually a significant number of Purple-Black Luffy results. Generally, the list has stabilized into an 8-cost Moria deck that uses 5-cost Sanji in the early game and the 9-cost Kaido in the late game to be able to control the board while creating his own board. The 8-cost Moria in this deck is exceptionally powerful if you can set up your trash correctly due to the fact that 4-cost Frankie is effectively 5-cost Queen that can be played off of Moria. In this way, if you can play something like the 4-cost Frankie as well as the 1-cost slot together with Moria, you are suddenly exploding your resources. Not only this, but due to the fact that he has things like Gum Gum Lightning, he can clear the board very efficiently from the early game without minusing his Dong, which is an extremely unique factor to this deck. I think that if you're building this deck and you don't run 4 Gum Gum Lightning, you probably just shouldn't be playing this deck, honestly. This is the strongest card in this deck, and the other cards such as 5-cost Sanji can also work very well with Gum Gum Lightning due to the fact that he doesn't reduce your Dong, meaning that you can clear 2 things per turn from very early on. If you can draw correctly with this deck can be extremely powerful, which is why you tend to see it do well in these more smaller scale tournaments. However, when it comes to larger tournaments with 8 or 9 plus rounds, it tends to get a bit harder to consistently keep winning, and as such, we probably haven't been able to see it too much in championships. If you do want to play this deck, however, I definitely think it could be a great deck for locals, especially when people don't really understand what could be in the deck, and 9-cost Kaido being only Dome -3 is absolutely terrifying for how powerful that card is. Ruh-roh, I'm back in my room because my phone ran out of battery as I was recording this. So I have 3 more decks that I want to talk about, so let's quickly get those over with. The first deck that I want to talk about is Hancock. Now, Hancock as a deck is very interesting because although she doesn't have a very good Doflamingo matchup, she has a very good Teach matchup. Although Shanks you can still lose due to the rush characters, Teach is actually very good for Hancock due to the fact that Red Rock can immediately clear his characters. All of her events bottom the opponent's characters, meaning that Jesus Spalajesse doesn't do anything, 10 cost Teach doesn't do anything, so it's up to the Hancock to not draw these cards to end up losing this matchup. The fact that Hancock is very good at controlling the opponent's board and also can keep drawing cards if she can manage her hand correctly from the early game means that she's a very tanky deck into other decks that want to try to control the board by playing one card per turn in the late game. This of course means that she's quite weak into decks such as Doflamingo, which is why this deck's running many cards such as the 4-cost Law, the 6-cost Joseph, and even the 7-cost Doflamingo to try to remove the opponent's board while creating their own board. If Hancock doesn't create her own board in the early game to be able to fight the opponent on the board, then just clearing one card per turn isn't enough against a deck like Doflamingo, who ends up playing multiple cards per turn. Hancock decks have actually improved a little bit since this point, but this was the first time that we saw Hancock do well in a championship. Since then, people have been taking in cards such as the 1-cost Law instead of things such as the 3-cost Doflamingo to be able to efficiently defend from the opponent's attacks while being able to develop their board with the rest of their don. Miraculously, this Hancock was able to dodge all the Doflamingos that it hit, but it did end up falling to 2 Shankses. However, one matchup that I perceive as extremely difficult for Hancock in Purple Luffy, they managed to win twice. So perhaps there's something I'm missing, or that things such as the 6-cost Hancock are able to tip the scales in these sorts of matchups to be able to stall the game to a point where Hancock can eventually win. Nonetheless, Hancock since this point has become a semi-meta deck. Another deck that actually got buffs in OP09, and we have seen here and there, is Belo. Now, Belo is what I would consider a burn aggro deck. It tries to finish the game in the first couple of turns, and if it fails to do so, it has no resources to be able to recover from that point. In this way, against normal aggro decks such as Doflamingo, she struggles immensely due to the fact that she runs out of resources before the Doflamingo player does. However, against decks that aren't Doflamingo, Belo has an extremely good matchup. Really, if Doflamingo didn't exist, Belo may just be one of the strongest decks in the meta, so perhaps in a way we can say thank you to Doflamingo. This deck actually was able to beat Doflamingo 2 out of 3 times on its game day. But the deck is actually very standard. It uses the new 6-cost Quota as well as the promo 2000 counter Sable, and plays the very standard Belo plan where you create your board very quickly and try to push over the opponent in the first 4 or 5 turns. Now, this player has said in their tweets that Doflamingo is still a very bad matchup, but despite this, they were able to beat it twice, as well as did good in other tournaments as I saw from their other results. So perhaps this is due to the fact that people haven't really played against Belo, don't really know what to expect. So Belo could be a really fun deck to bring to some of these tournaments where people just don't really know what she does. The last deck that I want to talk about is actually my own deck. Now, I actually played a lot of Vegapunk in OP09, but I never got to bring it to a championship. If you've been watching my videos for a while, you may know that I've been playing lots of Control Vegapunk. However, at the end of OP09, I was playing Aggro Vegapunk. This was heavily inspired by the NA player who won the championship with Aggro Vegapunk in OP08. Now, I think a large merit to using Aggro Vegapunk is that it has an extremely good 70+% win rate against Teach, as well as still having a very good matchup into Doflamingo due to the fact that it just is Vegapunk, and Vegapunk has a very good Doflamingo matchup in general. Not only this, but due to the fact that he's a very fast and aggressive deck, he can run over Purple Luffy in the same way that a deck like Belo does, and can also do well into Shanks if he can trigger out a character early game. I think that Vegapunk is extremely well-rounded for the meta, and I'm disappointed in myself that I couldn't actually show any sort of interesting results on it just due to the fact that I didn't get into a championship during this time period. But there was a Vegapunk player in the first OP10 championship that did go 7-2. He has put his list behind a paywall, so out of respect for him, I'm not showing it, but at least he proved that the deck could be very good in this meta. So, although it didn't actually leave any results, perhaps try this because I think it's very interesting. I am going to be putting out more Vegapunk content in the next week or so, but don't hold me to that. I hope that you guys enjoyed this video. I've noticed actually from my analytics that there's a lot of new people watching, and first of all, thank you. And if you consider subscribing, liking the video, this would all really help me and means a lot to me. So if you can help me in my goal to become #1, then I'd greatly appreciate it. Not much else I can say than that. But I will see you guys next time. I'll keep making content, and I hope that you have a very good day as well. Bye-bye.